Yeah.
A lot of pressure.
Yeah, exactly. Well, that one was the thought you were away.
Yeah.
No, just one. Yes. I know you would have fancy slides.
That's probably the Civic moral education.
Oh my god, this thing is so screwed up. I was just coming up to 30-second delay. Yeah, it does respond. It's like, yeah. So what do you, are you okay with this stuff for now? Are you okay with this stuff?
Yes.
I was gonna try to reboot the system. I did. Did you just totally pull the shutdown out?
Are you in full screen? Am I full screen?
Oh.
Yeah. Oh, thank you very much.
I'll talk
I thought you might. Okay, I was just about to send you one to say, don't kill yourself. I was really worried that you were gonna. So, yeah, take it easy. Yeah, and Lynn, as always, the thing I can do is pushing hours of videos. You know what? I'm gonna come back. Oh, come on. There's something too classic about that.
Thank you.
Oh, okay. Oh, that's good to know.
Like all the Greek. Yeah.
Well, whenever you're ready.
No, it's in the
Last week, because Matt, I saw Matt, he said he was in the county advertising contest.
Oh, I know. He's doing
Of course, welcome.
well, 23 now.
I'm sorry you missed your relax. Yeah, I know what you mean. I've seen it both ways. Yeah. Thanks for asking. Well, they've been very successful. Keep your daughter's comment go over. Good reaction. And you can make you laugh. But also,
I was looking for you like this.
I didn't even like to say my name. Thought I should turn around. I was saying it's first I was going for 5, and then
that's great. Yeah, I know.
they'll feel free to cut me off.
Yeah, it's nice to get things started.
Okay. Yeah, I just know
It is, but they edited it. So
I
it's oh my god, my god.
I have a class in 30 minutes, so I'm going to stay.
Yeah.
Give me a lunch.
It will be. main site?
Yeah.
It'll be on the main site.
Okay, wonderful. Thank
Great.
you.
Oh, great. Oh, in Winchester?
I
Oh,
live in,
excellent.
well, I do so.
You can join us and leave an early commute to this.
Hey, look, it works.
Oh, of course.
Oh, wait, no, it's not.
Well, what's going on is just really slow. And so we'll walk away and we'll come back with
Yeah, we're over on the west side.
Cool. I'm over off Main Street by the Verizon.
Yeah.
Do you like it?
I don't know.
You don't know yet? Okay.
Just signed it.
Oh, I think it's supposed to graduate. I love to like fold and great school stuff. Did you always say when you joined the school? Exactly. Beautiful school, isn't it? No? Sorry, it was like somewhere along the way. No, she was Hey, long time no see. How you doing? Good summer? Productive summer?
No, just so cool.
Yeah.
I'll be actually right next door for the next half hour.
I know it's hard for the student tomorrow, especially. I'm sorry. I think it's like the whole idea is like
This is always an experience.
I appreciate it, and like as a teacher, I appreciate what he's trying to teach his students, and I am annoyed. We do good learning strategy. Yes, in the sense that it's forced to be consolidated rather than but it's forced to be consolidated. It's not in my. We all do. Very much more of like a like it's nice to have our website.
Basically deliver.
Yeah, learn like
Yeah, it's like a structure.
Johnny
It's not like a paper, it's just like, yeah, it's expensive.
So we set up a classroom to work like a system. So basically,
I love it, I love it.
so basically everyone failed the test and which is not sure.
Sadly, the rest of the year
Well, I mean, the two of us
So, welcome to our kickoff of the 2014-15 CMEI Colloquium Series with Professor Helen Hayes. It is my very great pleasure to introduce Professor Hayes, who is a visiting professor here at Harvard, although one wouldn't realize that given how much involvement Helen has here at HGSE. Helen is also Professor Emeritus at University of Bath and co-editor of Political Psychology, still right? Yeah. And has written extensively in the field of civic education, in particular in cross-cultural contexts and how culture is brought to bear on civic education, written extensively. She's also directing the Early Career Scholars Program here, and we're in our third year now, and 24 scholars that work with us in that group. So it's my very great pleasure. We also have a doctoral discussant today, Jessica Fay, who is a third-year doctoral student and is working on issues of identity and narrative among adolescents, so very appropriate discussant for this talk. She'll give about 5 or 10 minutes talk after Helen finishes, and then we'll open it up to the floor. There's also a sign-in sheet floating around, so please do sign up. Even if you're already on our listserv, it's helpful to us to know who we reached in our publicity and who we have here. Okay? So, I don't know, if you have it, could you wave the sign-in sheet? Okay, great. Keep that moving. Okay, without further ado, Helen Hayes, thank you.
Thank you, Julia. Julia is the excellent and efficient coordinator of both the CMEI series and the Early Career Scholars Program. My life would not be possible without Julia, so thank you so much. Well, today I'm going to address the question of narrative, in particular the context of civic education. Now, some of you may be experts in narrative and very sophisticated about discursive analysis of narrative. I'm not doing that today. I'm talking fairly generally, because to some extent I think that narrative has not been brought to bear on civic education issues in the way that I think it should be. On the poster that you saw, the flyer that you saw, I had a brief reference to Woody Guthrie's famous song, "This Land Is Your Land." Now I use that because it's a very nice example of narrative both being referred to and also narrative being generated. Woody Guthrie actually wrote this song as a kind of counterweight to God Bless America, which he thought was very bland and rather saccharine. And he saw This Land Is Your Land as being a statement of inclusiveness, democracy, freedom, sharing, and basically celebrating the fact that we were all part of America, which is very beautiful. So this is just the first verse, which of course makes a geographical statement, and that he also included a couple of politically very significant verses which weren't always sung, which are making a strong statement of essentially a left-wing sort, particularly about to what extent actually is this land that all our land, basically. You see the quotations, particularly the last verse that he mentioned there, is questioning whether or not America was quite so free as people were claiming. And there are some key words, of course, in the verse above, particularly the term freedom, which is always a rhetorically strong narrative point in American contexts. Now, the concept of this land is your land, this land is my land, of course is challenged in a variety of ways. I particularly like this picture, which is very interesting. It contains a number of narratives. First, the narrative of homeland security. Homeland itself could, in a sense, being our land, but security, i.e. we need to protect it. And of course then the phrase fighting terrorism, the war against terror, which again is a strong narrative justifying all kinds of things currently, politically, in this country and elsewhere. But of course the point being, whose land, whose homeland? And of course, as we had to see, the 4 Native Americans. So, I bought that T-shirt when I was in the Navajo country, in fact, this summer. Okay, another concept. The idea that actually metaphors and narratives are highly culturally specific, and furthermore, they mean different things in different cultures. This is a headline which some of you may recognize, so I use it rather frequently. Never mind. America's Last Frontier. It's a common idea. America has a frontier, and the frontier is the boundary between wilderness and civilization. That boundary may be a geographical boundary, literally in the country itself. It was also used, of course, space, the last frontier. But the key point is, for Americans, the American context, the frontier is the boundary, as I said, between wilderness and civilization. Therefore, the wilderness is unoccupied, note. Furthermore, you go into the wilderness to prove your manhood. You do your Marlborough Man Act. I say manhood deliberately, not personhood. And you do your Marlborough Man Act by going into the wilderness and proving yourself by surviving there. That's a very powerful concept, widely used rhetorically in America, with all the narratives of frontier. But I'm a European. For me, in Europe, the frontier is the boundary between 2 states which have been equally civilized for the last 2,000 years. So if I go to France or Germany, I'm not likely to meet bears or strange creatures that might eat me. I will not die of starvation or cold in the middle of Berlin. The beer might be different, but basically it's a different concept of frontier. So therefore, the way that frontier is, what frontier evokes, the illusions implied by frontier in America are very different from what they would be in Europe. And that's just a simple example of cultural variation. Okay, another brief example. We also have our own sports. We have in England sticky wickets. You have things like getting to first base. If we unpack that, I'm not going to do that, we unpack that, the meanings are very different, but the contexts are very different. They'll be picked up in very different ways in different contexts. Again, I'm emphasizing the cultural specificness of narratives and metaphors. We have grand narratives. Grand narratives are the stories which are appealed to, often by very brief, even a single word or a single symbol, which evoke a huge history, a huge story, a huge explanation, and are very effective at communicating ideas, emotions, commitments, antagonisms. Martin Luther King made considerable reference to the Promised Land, biblical references. Partly this was an allusion to the end of slavery. Partly also it was picking up the fact that in the black community, particularly at that time, the church had a very important role, a very important community building role. So using a biblical reference anyway was a very important part of making contact with the black community, but as well the Promised Land has the context of slavery. Historical events, particularly battles, are frequently used to frame contemporary identities and of course to frame contemporary struggles. Some of these are extraordinarily ancient. There's a battle in Serbia. How many Serbians here? In 1389, the Battle of Kosovo was fought. The Serbians lost, the Ottoman Empire won, and Serbia became an Ottoman country. Serbia still uses the rhetoric of the Battle of Kosovo as a part of the history of endless oppression of Serbia, therefore endless struggle that Serbia has against oppressive forces, and it was brought up again in the post-Yugoslavian period. Another one, those of you who saw the film Braveheart, who saw Braveheart? Well, William Wallace didn't actually fight at the Battle of Bannockburn in 1304, but he fought at previous ones. And there were a number of battles around 1300 where the Scots won in fighting against the nasty English, us lot. But then eventually they lost, and also William Wallace was hung, drawn, quartered, emasculated, eviscerated, cut into 4 pieces and stuck on various parts of buildings in various parts of the country. To make a point, you don't mess with the English. Anyway, so but the point about that, Braveheart was picking up in a movie form a long, long established, very alive sense the Scots have that the English have been oppressing them for 700 or 800 years, which we probably have. Henry V, Shakespeare's play, which many of you probably have read, was made into a film during the Second World War by Laurence Olivier as a statement of Englishness, a very powerful propaganda statement. And we remember the Battle of Agincourt against the French because Henry won it with all those lovely things that Shakespeare had him say. What we don't remember perhaps quite so much is that Henry slaughtered practically everybody in every single city he laid siege to, men, women and children. It was not a very nice piece of work, but we don't remember that. But we do remember Agincourt and Englishness and Henry V. Manifest Destinies, again, narratives. The Americans revolted against the Brits, again, the Brits came to us rather a lot, and you rehearse it in every elementary school fiction story that kids read. It's always there. There's a manifest destiny of conquest. If any country conquers, they believe retrospectively that they have a manifest destiny to bring civilization to that country. The people who were conquered tend to have a rather different narrative of what would actually happen. There are hero figures who are, interestingly enough, appropriated differently by different sides at different times. For example, Joan of Arc, who keeps coming up. I discovered this only recently, actually. We all know who Joan of Arc is, a heroic figure fighting again the English. So revered by the French, but again, vilified in Shakespeare. If you read Henry VI, Joan of Arc is described as a slut, a whore, and various other nasty things. I'm quoting Shakespeare, by the way. It's not. But in the Second World War, the Vichy government in France, who were the ones who had surrendered to the Germans and were basically the occupying power, treated Joan of Arc as a heroic figure symbolising France. But they made her rather bland, and they dressed her in women's clothes she never wore. The other lot, the resistance, also had Joan of Arc as a symbol, but she was the heroic figure in armour fighting the oppressors. It's interesting, at the same time, in the same country, two different groups using the same symbol very differently. The narratives invoked were different. And most recently, different narratives are invoked. For example, of the good citizen. We've just seen in Jefferson County the conflict of two narratives around civil disobedience. The conservative local authority wanted to remove, to prevent young people, preferably, getting involved in civil disorder because it's unpatriotic. The people who revolted were saying, look, it's patriotic to be civilly disobedient. The narratives of America, Henry David Thoreau and others, have glorified civil disobedience in a particular context. So two narratives in conflict. So we're seeing here bringing in narratives to make powerful statements, to justify, to explain. Okay. Now this, you probably can't read this. This is a nice one. It is the memorial on Concord Bridge, which you can't see, but I'll read it out. Here on the 19th of April, 1775, note the narrative comments in here, was made the first forcible resistance to British aggression. On the opposite bank stood the American militia. Here stood the invading army, and on this spot the first of the enemy fell in the war of that revolution which gave independence to these United States. In gratitude to God, you know whose side he's on, and in the love of freedom, this monument was erected in 1836. When I first saw that, which was the first time I came to the States, I thought, they don't like the Brits very much. I think I've got over it, but it's a few years ago now. Okay, so why are we interested now in looking at narrative? Important things have been happening in the history of ideas, in the current climate of ideas, and particularly the climate of epistemology and how we approach lots of questions of explanation, questions of understanding. Here are a number of things that have been happening recently, just to summarise them. We're seeing an erosion, quite a substantial erosion, of what I'd call the post-Enlightenment emphasis on the pure reason, particularly pure reason that excludes or marginalises emotions. Emotions are not seen as, have not been seen as important, or they've been marginalised. This erosion of post-Enlightenment emphasis comes from a variety of people. Martha Nussbaum's just recently written another book which talks about the importance of recognising emotion in politics. Without emotion, we cannot really have justice. Neuroscience is showing us that actually the gap between the difference between reason and emotion in the brain is actually not like they thought it was. It's not there are two separate areas where there are emotions and reason. In fact, emotion and reason, they may be separately located, but they operate together. You almost can't have pure reason or pure emotion in most ordinary interactions. Both are in play. So the idea of a Cartesian split between reason and emotion is being eroded philosophically and in science. We are recognizing increasingly, we have for the last at least for 30 or 40 years, how central is communication in understanding anything to do with language and thought, and how we socially negotiate and how we socially construct meaning. And to understand any area of human behavior, we have to recognize the social and communication dimensions of it. Facts and logical propositions need to be considered in context. They can't be taken in isolation. They can't be taken out of the context. Well, they can be, but it is not a total picture. We want to understand how we use facts, how facts are generated, how facts are validated. We have to understand the context in which they are being used. They reside in the social domain. And my final point is the point that Jerome Brunner made, the difference between paradigmatic and narrative modes of thinking and communication. Paradigmatic being essentially logical, following through an argument in a logical sense, bringing in facts and evidence. In contrast, narrative modes tell a story. And the point that Brunner makes and other people make is that actually most of the time we do not use paradigmatic modes of thinking or speaking. Most of the time we use narrative modes. And in fact, we much earlier in life can understand and use narrative modes. A very small child will follow a story long before they can even speak themselves. And we'll get quite worried if you change that story. You know this. Of course, children do learn to use paradigmatic modes of reasoning with some difficulty, probably around the age of 5 or 6. But 1- and 2-year-olds follow stories. And narrative is the primary, in many ways, the primary mode that we relate to our experience and certainly to our communication with. Okay, as I talk about the relationship between narratives and civic education, let's remember that we're working with new civics here. We're working at a time when we're expanding the definition of civic participation to reflect what actually goes on in real-life civic action and real-life motivations for civic action. We're not just talking about voting and partisanship. We're not narrowly defining it in the old political science sense. Civic is everywhere, civic is all around us, civic is the community. And I shall be elaborating that in some of the examples I give later on. So what do we know about what engages young people in civic participation? If that is my question, which it is. What do we know? What we do know is that civic knowledge, although important, has a fairly minor role. Civic knowledge by itself does not predict action. More or less civic knowledge is a variable in the extent to which people become involved, but it's not the only explanation by far. However, unfortunately, in the past, a lot of education programs have emphasized civic knowledge to the exclusion of everything else, and have surprisingly enough not been terribly successful. What does work is having experience of being an effective agent in one's own community or one's own school. Acquisition both of skills, but also having the confidence coming from being effective. Experiencing a democratic school or a classroom environment where democracy also generates a propensity to becoming involved and being able to be involved. We notice also that what gets young people involved in civic action is single issues, especially where there's a moral component. The moral component that evokes a personal sense of responsibility in that person. I'm upset by something, I must do something. It's morally wrong, I must do something. And single issues are far, far more important. In fact, they're much, almost exclusively important in involving young people. Very few young people get involved in civic action because of, say, for example, party affiliation or other kinds of partisanship. It comes from a sense of a moral outrage or moral concern. Or it comes because you have friends who are involved in the action, in the movement, in the cause, and initially you may go along with your friends to the group meeting, and then subsequently you realise there's actually something going on here you want to get involved in, but you first go along because your friend goes, and that's very important for young people. So the peer group is a very important initiator. So these are the reasons, although what we know, that promotes and facilitates civic engagement. I want to stress in my talk the importance of identity, which is also why it isn't just about knowledge. Becoming involved in civic action is something about you, being who you are. You're the kind of person who. I'm the kind of person who does such and such. I am touched because I am morally disturbed by something. I am touched because I feel I can do something. I am touched in some way because who I am is tied up with this action, particularly as, on the whole, civic action is very time-consuming and certainly energy-consuming. So to care, if you're going to care, it has to be something about you. So we have to look at what identity is. I've been working for some time now with the concept that identity can be explained in part by three elements. Now there may be more, but I'm going to focus on these three. One is efficacy. Do I have the skills? Do I have the confidence to believe I can do something? Am I efficacious? And how do we promote that sense of efficacy in young people? Secondly, what are the narratives to which I'm exposed, which tell me stories about what matters, tell me stories about how to behave, tell me stories how to become engaged, tell me stories about what the problem is and why the problem is there, tell me stories about what the solutions are, not only what I can do but what can be done. What are the stories I have been told? And they are stories more likely than facts or logic. The story has involved me, the story has engaged me. Thirdly, positioning. The story positions. It positions me as a potential actor. It may position you as a victim. It may position you as an oppressor. It may position you as a group who we don't want to know because you're different. Or it may position you as a group who really are vulnerable and in need of help. A narrative positions groups and individuals in ways that locate the identity of the actor in terms of what they think, what they believe, how they feel, and what they eventually may do. The positioning is a very important part of what we have to take account of. Okay, what do narratives do? What narratives do, first, they have these components, and these are important, and this is why narratives are not just paradigmatic statements of fact or logic. A narrative has a starting point, it has a sequence, it has an ending. It has a plot. So there's a beginning, middle, and end. And you come into it thinking, what's happening next? That's a key point about it. Secondly, these imply that there is causality and there are consequences. By having any kind of story, somehow, whatever is being referred to, there's some kind of causal origin. It's probably usually implicit. And there are consequences. Something will follow from the causality, the events, and the consequences. The narrative also implies values, the dominant values which are expressed through the narrative, probably implicitly. These values both explain the consequences, in other words, you do bad things, naughty things, dreadful things will happen to you, but also that values generally make judgments about what is desirable, what is good, what is bad, what is expected, what is unexpected, and why. And also, as I said earlier, they position the actors vis-à-vis each other in terms of power, but also in terms of obligations. To whom do I have obligations as a consequence of this story? In this story, where the obligations lie? To whom do I have affection, emotional relationships? And again, if I'm telling a narrative, how am I, vis-à-vis the audience, evoking your affect, evoking your emotional response? How does the story make you weep, make you laugh, make you feel joyful, make you feel angry? And also, stories usually also indicate where efficacy lies, what can be done, what action potential is there, and how can it be done. So the story has all these things. Now you can say, what kind of story? Well, I would say even the Three Bears has these concepts. I don't think much. You could find political dimensions in the Three Bears. Yes, discussed. Three Bears of civic action, discussed. Well, perhaps not. But the Three Bears has all the characteristics that I'm describing. If you want to unpack it, it has certain consequences. Goldilocks is rather a nasty piece of work, if you recall. Okay, right. What narratives also do? Narratives work because they assume common ground. A narrative only works on its own terms if people share the same background, share the same illusions, share the same experiences. But by implication, when you tell a story, you are defining what is normative. By telling a story, you are saying something about what is to be expected, what is taken for granted, what is assumed to be normal. But also, a story can make explicit what's problematic and what's not shared, because a story will, by the way it's told, indicate this is surprising, this is unusual, this is wrong, this is a problem, this must be solved. This is not normative, this is not normal, this is unusual, this is to be explained, this is to be managed. And of course, narratives evoke, as I said, emotional responses. Here's two quotations, there are many I could have used. The role of narratives in our lives. Amisai Margalit, who's an Israeli philosopher, wrote, "Human beings lead collective existences based on symbols that encapsulate shared memories." So he's emphasizing the importance of shared memory. The common ground here is the shared memory and the stories, and so in this case he said symbols, but this applies to stories as well, work because we have common memories of the events in question. So we understand the story in a particular way. A second example from someone called Jonathan Gottschall. The story is the glue of human social life. Note, defining groups and holding them together. So by asserting what is normative, asserting what is normal and taken for granted, we are defining us versus them. And those stories will sustain and maintain us. And the examples I gave earlier of how events in history are used to justify and explain contemporary events. That's again part of the process. The story holds us together. It defines the groups. It holds us together. Okay, that's my background, if you like, theory, rather brief, somewhat of a superficial, but it's covering a lot of ground. Let's look at some examples. I emphasised in my abstract, I'm going to talk about different cultures. I want you to pay attention in the 3 lots of data I'm going to show you how different cultural assumptions are being made, how different cultural allusions are being made, how different cultural values are being forefronted and referred to, and what we can actually learn a great deal, how we can actually learn a great deal, particularly in 2 of the examples, about cultures which are, for most of us, very different from the culture with which we are familiar. The first lot of data comes from a study that I did some years ago now on young people's perceptions of the future. The argument is that our views of the future are kind of narratives. They're narratives and stories. How we see the future, in fact, reflects not only how we see the present, but actually in a way defines how we see the present, because how we see the future, the potential, in a sense imposes upon us in the present certain, if not obligations, at least expectations, which define to some extent how we respond to events in the present. And what we have is a lot of work on the future. I'm just using other people's definitions here. Well, first let's study questions. The study questions we asked, what issues are of concern to young people when they contemplate the future, and how do responses to different scenarios relate to civic values and to action? There are 4 scenarios that have come out from research on the future. This is not just my research, it's generally been found in research on the future. When you ask people about the future, you've got 4 different versions of what comes out. One is the future is business as usual. The future is like the present, same issues, same solutions, but slightly more high-tech, basically. Today and tomorrow pretty much the same, but the computer, the iPad will not look like it does today, and will we have those great, big, huge laptops? Probably not. But huge compared to the future, not the past. Secondly, the technological fix. Science and technology will accelerate and will solve engineering, medical and economic problems, and by implication social problems. So technology will fix things. The future's better. The third one is the future's worst. We're on the edge of disaster. Things will get worse in terms of both natural and social conditions, climate change, etc., and other things too. And finally, the fourth one, we will have a peaceful and sustainable society because we have found a way to work together for peace, sustainability, and justice. Again, a positive view. There are 4 different scenarios that tend to come out again and again when you are thinking about the future. Okay, our questionnaire, which this is actually a quantitative study, asked about recent civic action, so we have some measure of action. It asked about future action. It asked about how they define a good citizen, on what issues they'd like to influence the government, how much they trusted the government, and to what extent they were upset by events in the news. By the way, that last one turned out to be the strongest predictor of action. If you were very upset by events in the news, you're much more likely to have taken action in the last 2 years than if you weren't, but that's a slight aside. Okay. We did a patch analysis of the questionnaire items, particularly around good citizenship. We found 5 factors. I'll briefly summarise them because they're important in looking at the effect on the future. Active monitoring, generally being actively attending to current affairs. Conventional participation, expecting to vote, expecting to sign petitions. Conventional partisan things. Making one's voice heard. Protesting, signing petitions, contacting representations in government. Joining organisations. Some people just don't join organisations. It's just one of the things. We tend to go to both community organisations and also political parties. And fifthly, helping in the community and the environment, working to help people and also being concerned about environmental issues. Those seem to there were 5 distinct factors that emerged. Right. 5 typologies of conceptualising good citizenship and anticipatory action. The business as usual, the future is pretty much the same as the present. It went with the factor conventional participation, and it also went with the item trusting the government. People trust the government, and they tend to be involved in conventional participation, and basically they think the future will be pretty much like the present. The edge of disaster. It went along with, not surprisingly, the fact of making one's voice heard, and protesting, taking part in protest, having participated in protest action, but also helping others, and having a low trust in the government, and being often upset by events in the news. Pretty pessimistic, in other words. Technological fix, actively monitoring, keeping an eye on what's going on in the news, and joining organisations. Believing that their votes count. Being concerned about healthcare, facilities for young people, control of crime and immigration. Generally being upbeat and positive, that the system works and that the future will get even better. Peace and sustainability, again, active monitoring, joining organisations like before, believing votes count, believing they're getting their voices heard, they trust the government, and they believe they'll be active participants in the future. Again, upbeat, community-oriented. Now, in summary, both technological fix and peace and sustainability narratives of the future are associated with trust and faith that one's voice will be heard. And peace and sustainability was also associated with getting involved in good citizen activities. Business as usual was associated with very few civic variables. Basically, it's pretty bland. But edge of disaster is interesting because it's consistent with work that shows having a low trust in the government and being upset by events in the news is conducive to taking protest-type actions, making one's voice heard. It's an interesting education implication because people tend to assume that being a good citizen, being active, goes with high level of trust in the government and having a positive view of the future. Well, we see it does in conventional participation, but in fact, a negative view of the future, to an extent, motivates people to take action, particularly if they feel they can do something about the future. So the narrative of the future does link to the way the present is conceptualized in terms of what people do, what they think about, that they should do in the context of citizenship. My second example, my second data set. This research was located in South Africa in the spring of 1994. Nelson Mandela has just become president. And the question we're asking is about the relationship between the narratives, identity, and positioning in a new society. It's a very exciting time. And somebody who was a doctoral student here at that time, who came from that country, in fact had grown up in that environment, did a doctoral dissertation where he interviewed a dozen young people aged 18 from a township in Cape Town, all non-white young people in a township in Cape Town, who for the first time had been able to get the vote, not only themselves, but also their parents for the first time become enfranchised. It's an amazing time, a time of rapid change. And I'm going to use some quotes from one of these young men, a very articulate young man who I call JJ, because it captures very, very strongly the narratives that were being invoked at that time to explain the past, explain the present, and also to motivate young people's engagement and involvement in this new society. The point I'll make is that most of what they say actually was said by Mandela. What these young people were doing was taking ownership of Mandela's narratives, incorporating them into their own identity and making it very strongly a part of their motivation to be actively involved. These young people had all been pretty actively involved in what was called the struggles prior to the end of apartheid. I want you to read, there's quite a fair amount of reading, but it's worth doing. Here's the first quote. This is about the history. You can read. Can you see? I think to read it. I won't read it out. Okay, so you can see there are two narratives. One emphasises the personal vices of the colonists. The colonists were vicious, nasty people. And secondly, that there was a practice of divide and rule was in place. So we've got two distinct narratives about history. Note this is history, this is a story of history that contextualises the present. Here's the second block. Here again, we see two narratives. A new narrative of pride, but it's defined by its contrast with the previous narrative of a shared identity of oppression. Very clearly, these two narratives are juxtaposed as this young man talks about how he became proud of who he was. Here's another one. This gets very interesting. I've unpacked these narratives on the next slide. Somehow the spacing slipped, but never mind. We've got the four narratives. The first is the narrative of past oppression. The second narrative distinguishes those white people who did not endorse apartheid but failed to stand up for the oppressed groups. So their moral failure is lack of courage. It's the second narrative, it's lack of courage of some white people. The third narrative is how humanity transcends race and prescribes equality. And the fourth narrative, which is, I think, Mandela's brilliant new narrative, which empowers the former oppressed groups by giving them the moral responsibility to educate the whites in humanity. No revenge. These formerly oppressed groups are now morally responsible for educating their former oppressors in what it is to be human. Very clever of Mandela. Here's the fourth one. What do you see yourself as? This is again an identity one. What are the narratives here? This extract first elaborates the narrative of humanity and unity in two ways. Both the transcendence of race under the category human, in other words, human transcends race, and also the argument that labelling per se is divisive and undermines this. Secondly, it elaborates the narrative of moral responsibility for re-education. So it repeats what was said before, elaborates it further. Now, as I said, pretty much everything that young man said came from Mandela. All the kids said very similar things, but the striking thing was they were not just parroting Mandela, they had taken Mandela's narratives on board with all the optimism and hope that they could possibly have at that very exciting time. And it's a beautiful example of all the things I'm talking about in terms of how narrative works and how as a story, but also how narrative works as a very strong factor in inspiring and motivating and empowering young people. It works in terms of positioning. So what's positioning going on? How does the narrative position people? Well, firstly, the founders of the Cape Colony are positioned as morally egregious. So he positions the non-white population as victims of an immoral tradition. In consequence, the victims are deprived of dignity. So that's the positioning. If you say that if you treat the founders as immoral, then you'll see how the positioning of the oppressed happens. This is a counterpoint then, however, to the repositioning of non-white identity. He differentiates those whites who are pro-apartheid from those who are apologetic, but then further positions these latter as lacking in commitment. He then asks, and this gets interesting, should non-whites position whites now as victims in retribution? Or should they position non-whites as morally superior because they can take a comprehensively humanistic view? So all this is going on. It's a relatively short quote, and you will see how subtle and complex the positioning process is in this way. Extending it further, he extends the positioning of moral superiority to moral obligation. Non-whites must teach the whites to be humanistic. So he elegantly positions the whites not only as morally deficient, but now as less powerful because they're placed in the role of students. In the fourth extract, he repeats some of the argumentation about retribution, but also positions himself as a human being and South African, explicitly to counter positioning that he sees in apartheid that rose through labels. It's a beautiful, beautiful set of narratives and positioning in action. And I have to say that the person who did the work, Sally Abrams, collected the data, and he and I have worked on this over the years to arrive at these interpretations. My final example, China, 2011. 8th, 11th grade students in Shanghai and Nantong, in collaboration with Xu Zhao, who was a graduate from the school, who was our absolutely invaluable research officer, Robert Selman, who's here, and Xian Luan, who's a doctoral student at East China Normal University, our partner, who again worked with us on the analysis. Okay, we were working with focus groups with these kids, and I'm going to just summarize our findings because it's too much detail to go into about the technicalities. But if you want to know more about it, we have a paper which is, I think, in press, isn't it, Bob?
Second review.
Second review, right, under review, which we're very happy to circulate. Okay, now.
Optimistic.
Well, it's a very good paper. I read it yesterday. I was impressed when we read how good it was. I'm only the second author or the third author, so I can say that. But we found 3 narratives about the causes of social problems. We asked about social problems in China and solutions to the problems. And there were 3 narratives emerged. One was individual moral failures and low-quality people are the causes of social problems in China. The second was there are systematic flaws in the system in China. And thirdly, what we call macro conditions. I'm going to give you some brief quotations to illustrate these. Just summarizing the overall findings. We found 4 narratives about possible solutions to social problems. The 4 narratives, individuals should change their behavior. The second one was that government should change behavior. Third was there was no solution, but all we had to do is to focus on our own individual survival because we can do nothing. And the fourth one was that citizens can and should influence governmental and institutional behavior. 4 different narratives about possible solutions. And together, these narratives reflect what we call 3 discourses: a discourse of being compliant, a discourse of cynicism and being cynical, a discourse of being critical. And I'm going to illustrate them with quotations from the text. Let's look at the individual narrative around the cause of food safety problems. China has many problems of food safety. This is a focus group, so we've had a conversation. It is human greed. Individual failure. Some people only think about short-term profit, ignore long-term impact. Again, individual failure. Coordinator. Why do people do that? Because of a materialistic view of life. Again, moral failure, individual failure. Okay, let's look at the systemic narrative, the causes of food safety problems. Here we're looking now not at the individual, we're looking at the system. Can you read this? Food safety is a big issue. What happens now is that people look for solutions only when the problems have become very serious. It should be the other way around. The problem should be identified before the bad food is produced. The system is really not working. Food safety is only a surface issue. The real problem is now nobody cares about the country and serves the public, and serving the public. They're all pursuing self-interest. If a small number of people do that, things will be much better. Now, to some extent, that's individual, but it's in the larger context. The laws of China have problems. There are loopholes. It's a one-party system. What do you expect? These young people were remarkably critical, by the way, of their government. Chinese kids are not subserviently obedient to the Chinese government. Well, not all of them anyway. The third one, macro narrative, the problems, in this case, the question is the problem of income disparity, which is huge in China. And here we see an explanation at governmental policy level. Whether the government wants to develop a place and issues policies to promote its development, like what happened in the Pudong district here. Pudong's a part of Shanghai which has been rapidly and gloriously actually developed, with huge skyscrapers. A lot of money is there. Historical reasons and geographic location are also important factors. So again, a macro story. Geographical location, people living in the valley, no matter how hard they work, they cannot catch up with the city. Then generation after generation, the gap will be larger. You see the difference in those three types of narrative. Very different kinds of stories, different kinds of explanations, kinds of causes and consequences, very different allusions being made to norms, to problems, to possible solutions. Individual solutions, let's go solutions now. What can we do about the environmental problem mentioned? Don't throw, and we have a whole series of things individuals can do. Don't throw garbage, pick up litter, plant more trees, and unsafe food. Report to the town ministry, don't buy the food, tell us not to buy it. Overloaded buses, if buses are overloaded, tell people, wait for the next bus. So really totally individual, not at all systemic. The narratives are very much concrete, based on experience of everyday life, what you can do as an individual person, even if you're only an 8th grade kid. Now, the role of government in solutions. Government has a role. And note first that we see powerlessness. What can we do? This is not something under our control. Next level up, in terms of complexity. Teachers need to change their behaviour. It has to be through parents, not students. If you try to deal with a problem, we may be punished by the principal and lose good connections, to be realistic. Change cannot be made overnight. Education in China, the new China was established only 50 years ago. Chinese education has to be improved step by step, slowly. This is a realistic approach. So it's a more macro approach, seeing the total system, seeing the government being involved, seeing people not them as individuals powerful, but if change is going to happen, it has to be at the systemic level. Here's an important idea of powerlessness and what we should do to seeking our own survival, given the difficulties of surviving. Focus on our own business. Work hard to make money. What else? The cost of living is high. We cannot rely on our parents. We better take care of our own business. What else can we do? It's not like you want to change things and then you can. What do we do? Another choice is start a revolution. Group laughs. He is kidding. It's not possible in China. If you start a revolution, nobody would follow you. People are not fools. It's a one-party system. Back again to the one-party system. They don't like the one-party system. Now, at the most sophisticated level, the idea that, in fact, individuals should try to influence and have the responsibility, right to demand government accountability. So it's a recognition of that there is a sense that the individual shouldn't just be minding their own business, they should actually be trying to influence the government, but the government itself has to change. So you see here, we need things as organisations, but now many organisations are not well organised and not functioning well. They need people who are willing to serve the public. The government should organise these people together to solve this problem. It won't work if the government picks a person from one of the departments and leaves the job to that person. They should pick people who are concerned about the issue and who are willing to do it, not people who do the work perfunctorily just to obey an order. So this young man or woman is seeing the total picture, or they're talking about individuals, they're seeing it in the totality of an organisation, recognised only through complex organisations within the government can real change take place. They're recognising the obligation of the individual to participate, but they're recognising that the system itself has to change. Our three discourses or orientations that came out from our analysis we call them, I will define them in terms of the narratives and also the action orientations following from the narratives. I said earlier on that narratives have action implications. Narratives have implications of what is possible, what can be done, and by whom, and what should be done. And the compliant category, what we call the compliant discourse, looks like this, and you can imagine how it drew on the various examples of quotations. Individual responsibility and appropriate action are defined by being loyal to the government, supporting government policies, fully cooperating with the government, and when necessary, sacrificing self-interest to reduce the government's burden and workload. The government is positioned as trustworthy, with an action implication of deference to government officials. That's the compliant story that particularly the younger kids and the rural kids actually said. The cynical orientation, found particularly among the urban kids, older urban kids at that. Figures and institutions of government are corrupt, they are face-conscious, they're unresponsive, and they're unchangeable. Individual responsibility is to take care of oneself and one's family and be wary of the government. I think cynical describes that rather beautifully. Finally, critical. There were very few kids who expressed a critical point of view. Possibly it comes later in development. There's probably only one kid said a lot of it. But what we see here is the beginning of a perspective which isn't powerless, and does recognise the larger obligations. The government is corrupt and untrustworthy, yes. However, individuals' united efforts may potentially influence the government. Instead of powerlessness, the messages of civic agency and efficacy. Individuals should take responsibility to monitor and influence the government and institutional behaviour. Now, that's the Chinese data. I think you have a flavour, although it's a brief sense, of exactly how variable and how different, how fundamentally different, at least the Chinese and South African cultures are, the Chinese and South African narratives are. Reflected in these very brief quotations, you can see if they're coming from very different places. Could they talk to each other, you might ask yourself. I didn't ask myself the question. It's an interesting question. Could JJ talk to these Chinese kids on the same wavelength? What kind of common ground would have to be sought before it's possible? Finally, what are research implications? What should we be doing to understand my question about civic education or civic engagement also, and narratives? These research questions, I think, are crucial to pursuing these ideas. Firstly, how do narratives reflect what is normative and what is problematic? What is presumed common ground? What are the shared illusions and values in the narrative we are perhaps researching? What are the explanations of causality and consequences which are implied in the narrative? How does the narrative position the narrator? How does it position the interlocutors? And how does it position others, other persons, other groups? What are the affect and motivation implications? What are the action implications of the narrative? Perhaps we won't go back to the three bears, but I mean the more complex narrative. Any narrative we picked can be taken apart in terms of these questions. It's very rich if you start doing it, as I've shown you, with narratives produced by young people talking about civic engagement. And finally, what are the education implications? Knowledge of facts is not enough. Students need to understand the narratives that are behind civic norms, behind values, behind laws, civic beliefs, and also behind social movements. So we need to make sure our education includes their understanding of what the narratives are that underpin what they understand to be normative and in place. They need to reflect on how narratives position people and groups. Not just talking about we shouldn't discriminate against X or Y, but ask why, what are the stories that support our discrimination or otherwise against such groups? In terms that Bob uses, what are the narratives that underpin bystanding and upstanding? They need to be aware of implied action possibilities, including their own. What is possible? What can they do? What do the narratives indicate is possible or is not possible? Is civil disobedience unpatriotic? One asks in Justice and County. What are the action implications? They need to reflect on the affective and intentional dimensions of potential civic action and learn how to manage affect, not deny. I feel strongly about this. We tend to teach people to manage emotion by denying it or suppressing it. The competence we need in the 21st century is to manage emotions and to recognise it doesn't go away. It has to be managed in the sense of fully understood and fully used and fully channeled, not denied or removed or exorcised. And maybe there are education implications. I look forward to hearing your suggestions. Thank you. Jessica. You have got slides, have you, sir?
No slides. So, hi everyone. I'm Jessica, as Julia mentioned before, and I'm a doctoral student here at the Education School. I'm also a member of the second cohort of the Early Career Scholars Program, so I've had the privilege of learning from Helen for the past year. And I just want to say how nice it is to be here and have you here joining in this dialogue, so thank you for your presence. I also wanted to say, I know given all the richness of Helen's presentation, I'm really eager to hear everyone engage in the dialogue, so I'm going to try to keep my time short so that we can really unravel the complexity of these themes together. And also, just in the interest of transparency, I do want to say up front that I am a really strong believer in stories and storytelling. It's something that I explore a lot in my own research. And oftentimes when I situate my own work, I'm looking at research that has shown that really stories have always been a part of empowerment and change and survival and healing for communities, particularly for communities who occupy marginalized positions in society. So I sort of come with that, with those strong beliefs to this space, and I'm not going to be challenging the fundamental premise of this presentation, which is that civic education needs stories and that stories are important. But what I do hope to do is raise some key questions that I think this claim raises for us all, no matter what positions we occupy in the field of education or in civics, that I think are just really relevant to us all. So I think really these questions for me revolve centrally around whose stories we're talking about and why these stories are so sorely needed to advance the field of civic education, which is an evolving field and is in a very exciting place right now. So to do this, I thought I'd think about these topics with further attention to power, and also with a bit of a sociological view to sort of see this more in context. So to begin, I'd just like to highlight how incredible I think Helen's approach to civics is as a model for really thinking about civics in context and thinking about the situatedness of all the narratives that are shared and the experiences that we live. It really is looking at the dynamic interactions between individuals, institutions, and the larger macro context that we occupy. And I really feel that looking at context and understanding where we're coming from in that sense is crucial to understanding how civics plays out in lives that are very different from our own. In some of my own research, I've looked at the neighborhood narratives of young people, and I found that there are many young people who carved out specific spaces, even within their own localities, that they identified as their own spheres of belonging, as the places that they attached their belonging and where they wanted to have an impact as well. And so when you see that, you sort of take that pause and think, you know, it's necessary to step out of our own narratives and our own worldviews in order to understand how people see their worlds. And that sometimes when we're talking about society, we're often talking about a collection of social worlds that sometimes exist in tension and sometimes are defined in contradistinction to one another. So I think that thinking about context is crucial. I think another thing is that this work really speaks to the importance of studying stories as a unit for study. And I think as Helen has demonstrated, holding stories up for careful view, you know, for bringing it to a screen and really looking carefully at how people are positioning themselves and expressing their values is key to our civic practice. I think that stories not only hold a key to further understanding who we are and where we want to go, I think they also offer an opportunity to interrogate ideologies and things that we take to be common sense that may actually be maintaining a status quo that we are unhappy with in society. And so I think here I'd like to raise my first question about whose stories we're talking about when we say civic education needs stories. Many scholars have contended that schools tend to perpetuate the dominant narratives in society, and oftentimes these narratives are racialized and pernicious and can distort and dehumanize communities whose own stories then don't get to be heard. We see these stories in books that are banned from school. Interestingly, it is Banned Books Week right now, celebrating the freedom of people to read. And I think we also see it sometimes in the narratives that frame how schools interact with teachers, with their local communities, and with the students themselves when we look at narratives of lazy teachers or parents who just don't care. I think it's clear that as powerful as stories are, some of them do function to do harm, and some of them do function to humanize and do good. So when reflecting on stories, I think it's critical that we look at our own context of a society that is marked by inequality, where hierarchies of power do exist, and where our stories are on uneven ground. I think looked at in that context, civic education seems to be a bit of a symbolic battleground where we can see stories coming into conflict, sometimes in our classrooms and sometimes in the streets. And I think even as we come together in this space at this colloquium, we might think about whose stories are here, whose stories are getting privileged, and whose stories might be getting distorted or silenced in some way. I think this also raises the question of whether it's reasonable to expect that all stories, all the different stories that we tell, have some place in this larger landscape of civic education when we're operating in schools or when we're just creating space to talk about these things. And if all stories do have a place, how do we create the space for that to happen? What sort of structures would need to change in order for all those stories to be heard? Or if all stories can't or shouldn't be told, then how do we decide what stories to privilege and who gets to decide that? I think of those stories too that ultimately do get presented, we need to think about what questions we want our students to ask and whether they're the same questions that researchers ask of the narratives that they look at or whether they're fundamentally different. I also think that we need to return sort of to a core question here, which is towards what end does civic education need stories? What is really the future that we hope that these stories are driving us towards? And I think this is a question that we might explore in our discussion, and I would just like to ground it with an invitation for us to apply the sort of critical lens that Helen does in her work to the stories of civic education and the stories of civics that we all bring to this space. I think that one major thing that I've learned in my first forays into the study of discourse and stories is that really, as much as I'm looking at the narratives of research participants and interrogating their meaning, I also need to interrogate myself because the discourses that are available to participants are often the discourses that are available on a societal level, and they shape my subjectivities and identity. And they also, in the stories that I am going to tell about the data, can reveal the ideologies that are at work in my own everyday life. So I think that in the process of interrogation, we need to include ourselves in the mix. And just to put myself in the mix here a little bit, when I was thinking about what I might say in this space, I thought about the different stories of civics that matter to me right now. I thought about the recent story about young people in Ferguson resurrecting a memorial for Mike Brown after it had mysteriously burned to the ground just a few days ago. I thought about students in Denver and the teachers who planned to stick out just before that to protest the teacher evaluation system in place. I thought about the climate change rally in New York City, and I realized that these are the stories that matter to me. They're the stories that give me glimpses into the sort of civic society that I value most, the sort of everyday acts of citizenship that I want to spend my time thinking about and involved in. And I think that we sort of owe this reflexivity to our own work and this kind of transparency to the young people who we serve. I guess I just hope that this can be an occasion where we can hold our own stories up for careful view in the way that we hold other stories up. And to think about, in our own positions of power, how these narratives matter and what actions they mean we're going to take.
Thank you, Jessica. Well, we'll sit in front here with our chairs forward, and we will welcome your questions and comments. You can sit in front, actually, otherwise we get you obscured by the desk. We'll sit in front. You get
I don't
through.
know that I can speak. I'll stay right over here.
Okay, that's in the corner in that case. Yeah. All right, so who would like to begin with comments to myself or Jessica or just one with Andrew?
Do you think it would make sense to
Hang on, rules. Can you say who you are before you speak so that when we know who everybody is? Okay, Andrew, who are you?
Andrew Conning, doctoral student.
Thank you.
So yeah, I just was thinking, throughout the presentation, how useful it would be to put all of it into a developmental framework. Maybe just to start from the end. So the educational implications. So what do we teach people? What is the goal? What are we teaching them toward? So if we take all of those parts of the narrative and we look at it developmentally, that shows us how the growth happens and where it's supposed to go to. So it seems like all those things are developmental. I mean, identity, values, causality, all those things are developmental. And then look at any kind of civic participation. So like the Mandela understanding of what good citizenship is in South Africa in 1994 is really more developed than, say, a more violent response. A nonviolent protest in Ferguson is more, developed than a violent looting or something like that. Martin Luther King compared to Malcolm X, any kind of civic situation provides, a range of different ways of understanding it and reacting to it that represent growth. And so, and that can include emotion as well, because people say, well, when you talk about development, you're saying it's just cognitive, and then but civic action is not just cognitive, it's
And
emotion.
make it a question, not a comment.
Okay, sorry.
I think you answered your question about development. Is it development?
Yeah, I mean, just find out about the emotion. I mean, your emotions also, the things that push your emotional buttons can develop.
Can I ask you, Nick? I think just briefly, I'd like to say there's certainly I haven't talked about development in the talk. It wasn't the scope. I do another talk on that. But obviously, we've seen some hints of individual development in the China data. We've seen responses that probably belong with younger kids, and responses that probably belong in older kids. So at the individual level of development, we can see that. We've certainly seen in the description of South Africa a society in rapid change. We could say certainly it's in development. I would differentiate the development of society from development of individuals. But I think, yes, you could certainly, how a 4-year-old will explain causality is different from how a 14-year-old and how a 40-year-old will. So breaking down, if we break down the analysis of narratives, we would expect to see different kinds of things being salient and understood and common ground in different developmental stages of the individual. Possibly one might argue that in a societal context, different things will be seen as common ground in different periods of social change. I have problems with the ideality of societies, as you know, but certainly societies change. Some get worse, some get better. So that, I think, yes, of course, is a developmental element. That wasn't what I was stressing, but indeed, yes. Just in, Jessica. Okay, right. Thanks for your comment. It's helpful. But yes, that's another talk. I'll do that next week. Who else would like to say something or comment? Yes. Who are you?
My name is Paula. I'm a master's student in the IEP program, and along with Jenna and a couple of other students, we're pursuing an idea. We'd like to look at like IDP communities, like people and populations who've been displaced either because of conflict or natural disasters. And so I'm interested in like civic education, and the examples that you've given, like this land is your land, this land is my land. It seems very rooted in location.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you're an IDP, an internally displaced person, and you're uprooted from your location and you're forcibly moved to somewhere else, I was just wondering, like, I wanted to hear your thoughts on how civic narratives could possibly address
act to reconstruct.
Right.
Act to reconstruct, yes. I think this is Jessica who answers this. It's very much her field.
I think that's a great question. I guess the first thing that is on my mind is imagined communities, and the way that people, place ends up taking on a very symbolic meaning to people, whether they're actually physically in that same space or not. It brings to mind feelings of community and home and perhaps happiness, or the sort of future that they envision and that they would want in some form, perhaps no matter what geographical location they're in. So I think that creating space for those narratives to be shared about any places that people come, interestingly. I worked with a group of young people over the summer in Cambridge on a project that was mapping stories of Cambridge, and most of the stories of Cambridge were taking place outside of Cambridge because people brought with them histories of their families and their own lives that often unfolded in places that were not physically here, but in their imagination and in their emotional universe are just as much present in their daily lives in Cambridge as they may have been in a different place. So I think that an exercise, or that creates space for all those different stories to be shared of a different place, and that recognize that every place is sort of bound to other places and they're all interconnected, can sometimes be a really interesting process of healing and empowerment, as I was sort of talking about before with stories. And I think that the way in which they can prompt action is particularly powerful too, in that the communities that we imagine can also become a source for our ability to collectively organize and to find routes of communication using media that's available or anything else to actually be connected with people who we want to be connected with. So it might sort of open up some possibilities just for those narratives to be shared. I don't know if that was addressed your question at all.
I'd like to turn to Vidal, who worked with displaced kids in Burundi, and I'd like to. I'm sure you have a comment about this. Introduce yourself first. I'm putting you in a spot, but I mean.
Thanks. I'm Vidal. I'm a fifth-year doctoral student. My research focuses on young people displaced by conflict and their understanding of their civic understandings. I think I completely agree with Jessica. I think the beauty of narratives is that sometimes they're while they're bound by place and geography, they're also drawn up. They take up space in our minds and our collective beings, and I think that's something that can be carried anywhere across different cultures and contexts. I think it's interesting to see how the stories and the narratives that are created and shaped in one space influence what you choose to do in another geographical space, and what are the options that you see for yourself within that particular community. Even though you might have formed those narratives in your own home country where you might have had the experience of conflict, violence, but what do you think, what are the possibilities that it allows you to imagine when you're, say, in an internally displaced camp or in a refugee camp? And I think that is really where we see, that narratives really do kind of, even while they're culturally bound and connected, but there's also a way in which they cut across spaces and time.
Thank you, Vidal.
Follow up on that, like, have you actually seen this happen, like, in your personal experience, like any examples?
Am I allowed?
Carry on, please. Yes. This is
Yeah, yes, I have. I mean, I think so. I can tell you a little bit about my work was with Congolese refugees from the refugees from the Democratic Republic of Congo, who recently, and these are young people who moved to a refugee camp in Burundi, and for many of them, because they had experienced such sort of severe violence and sort of ethnic conflict, they actually brought that entire narrative of sort of intergroup hatred. The reason why they left was because there were many different ethnic tribes that were fighting one another, and then when they were in this particular refugee camp where they're all sort of from different communities and different tribal groups that have come together to live in, they inhabit this one common space that they're probably going to continue inhabiting for the next 10 years or 15 years. And so you would imagine that that is your community, and so you begin to transcend these boundaries of tribe or caste or these different affiliations that divide us, and we see something that unifies. But instead, we see an exact replication of that, and that severely limits the civic possibilities to be able to actually work together to create some change, because community is not about us, but it's about us as a small little tribe. And so how do you envision us as a collective can vary at multiple levels.
Thanks, Vidal. It's very helpful. First, like to comment. Yes, no.
Very interesting.
Sorry, say who you are.
Okay, I'm Mong Neo. I am a second-year doctoral student, and I think that I heard some of these Chinese stories before, and so I think here in this presentation you went to a little more detail, so I really appreciate that. Specifically, in your interview, you found some of the Chinese students who were cynical. You mentioned maybe older urban kids, maybe the sense of powerlessness, and then also there are other students who thought that they're compliant, rural kids, and also there are other students who feel that although they are individuals, but they have an agency that they can come together. Even individually, their power is much less, but collectively they can influence the system. So I wonder what are the factors that could influence where someone sees themselves as a change agent or collectively can influence the system versus those who feel powerless.
That's a very good question, Mon, and the difficulty is we haven't quite done enough analysis to find that out. We have found that the more compliant kids, as I said, tend to be younger and more rural, and one could argue that simply because they're younger, they're less sophisticated in terms of understanding. Because they're rural, they're in a different kind of society, a society which on the whole is bound by rules and norms and regulations in a way that cities are not. But between the distinction between the cynical and the critical, the cynical kids were predominantly in an urban high school in Shanghai. And that's an environment where there's a lot of access to international material through the internet, a lot of general urban life, and access to narratives which both portray the government as cynical, but also portray the powerlessness and so on. I think that the kids who are relatively few so far, kids who have a critical perspective, are also exposed to the same kinds of narratives, but they're taking a more positive view of them. The information they have is that one can challenge the system, one should challenge the system. I think this is access that they will have to a variety of resources, possibly in their own community, possibly in their schools, possibly through the internet. So part of it is access to resources. Part of it, I think, also is as Andrew was suggesting, developmental. They are older kids, they have more time to reflect and develop things. But I mean, one can argue that you could take a crowd of 25-year-olds anywhere in the world. Some of them will be cynical and feel powerless with exactly the same background. Others will feel empowered and obligated to participate in social movements. What causes the difference is a question we have to ask. All we can say is that the narratives they are choosing to access are different. Whether they have different access to those narratives is a question which we actually can't answer for our data, but we get a bit more sophisticated about it than we have. Rob, you know anything about this? Just anything about the data? You, Rob Selman? No.
Yes. Since you asked.
Yes, I asked. This is Bob Selman, yes, in case you didn't know.
So I want to follow up on Andrew's comment, but try to do a little differently. All right? And I'll make a couple of comments then I'll ask a question. So my first comment is you cannot reduce narrative to development,
no.
And you cannot reduce development to narrative.
Mm-hmm.
They are epistemologically different lenses, and together they are beautiful, if you know them both. That's my pitch to this group. So, Helen, imagine a horizontal plane of discourses from compliant to cynical to critical. None necessarily better than the other, but different from one another, okay? And then imagine a vertical plane, okay, of two kinds. Okay, one would be concrete to abstract, right? And then there's another that I don't know how to figure out. And this is my question.
You have a question? Good.
Yeah. Where would you put the dimensionality of the individual and the society? Is it the case that making comments using to pick a term from linguistics, using a register, if you know what that means, if you know that term, I don't know if people are familiar with that term, but there's a linguistic term about register, which tends, anybody from language literacy? Shame.
Well, just translate it for us if you want to.
Yeah, so imagine kids having a narrative of individuals and another set of kids having a story or narrative of societies. How do those three dimensions connect to one another?
Mm-hmm. You always ask wonderful questions, Bob. I can't always answer them immediately. I think the point about individual society is you've got to the question. I can turn it around and say, a bit in response to what I said to Mong. Do they have access to narratives only about the individual, or only about society? And that can be about a matter of the location they live in. It can be a matter of the community they choose to listen to, which isn't quite the same thing as what's accessible to them. Or whether they don't have access to stories about society, or do they have access to stories about the individual only, individual and society, but don't understand the society narrative. So they will interpret the society narrative in terms of individual explanations. So you can imagine a situation where people say, well, the problems of poverty are because the social system doesn't provide adequate support for those who are deprived or unable to work. To which somebody who's going to an individual response will say, well, they're just lazy anyway, and if you gave them money, they'd just drink it, basically. We've all heard that.
Or society is crooked, the people are crooked.
Exactly.
So
what we've got there is, we've got two things. One is whether they misinterpret or choose to interpret societal explanation narratives in a much more simplistic and concrete and individualistic way, or whether they don't have access to them or don't. And I think there is a developmental factor of whether or not this particular person as yet understand an abstract concept, or have they had the training to help them to understand an abstract concept. You don't just come to abstract context by being older. You have to be properly trained. Amelia,
well,
who you are?
Oh, Amelia. I'm a first year doctoral student.
Thank you.
So this question kind of how you get this access. Some language arts teachers or literature teachers in high school level, the kind of cool radical ones, would say what they're trying to do is to help students unpick discourse and kind of unpick narratives and deconstruct things. But they usually keep quiet about it because sort of critical studies doesn't have a great history in public education. Do you think, putting this under the umbrella of new civics, do you think there's real potential to combine that, to find space for that in schools, or do you think that kind of language arts, given that it already has space in the curriculum, as in, is it under civics or is it under literature, or do they need to be combined? Where's the best place for this to be done?
It's a very good question, because I think that, and I want to let Jessica to answer it as well. I think the problem is that people say, do we need civics as a separate discipline, or is it encompassed by history and English? Because as you say, a lot of the critical reasoning, critical reflection is done in the humanities, and sometimes, occasionally, not always in history. The question is, in a sense, the capacity for critical reflection should be taught in all disciplines, whatever discipline it is. It isn't always. It should be taught in all disciplines. But whether or not the focus specifically on what we might call the civic domain can be taught directly in all areas, such that people become aware of it, as opposed to it being there in the background. It's difficult. I happen to think that actually there needs to be a space for civic education in some form, or civic and moral education, because you need to say, okay, let's have all this civic understanding, let's do this stuff we're talking about, but actually this particular domain needs particular skills, particular understanding, which is different from reading Jane Austen, or even reading that Battle of Bannockburn.
Sure, I'm not at all contesting that it needs its own space, but I guess it's more in terms of the skills of the teachers, of the people who can guide students towards this particular deconstruction of narrative. Should there be more collaboration here with people?
Certainly collaboration, yes. And I think ideally, in an ideal school, there would be collaboration amongst, in an ideal school, teachers would have ongoing discussions where they actually talked about the ways in which these various things pan out in different disciplines, which would be a very exciting school staff room. Most teachers haven't got the time to do this, and most schools don't encourage it for reasons to do primarily with time and curriculum pressures. But in an ideal world, there should be this cross-disciplinary fertilization of goals and how they're manifested in different poles. Jessica, you have some thoughts on this, I'm sure you do.
Sure.
I'll come on to you in a minute, yes. Yeah.
I guess sometimes it's strange for me to even think about what my own civic education has been because I never had a civics class. I didn't have any class that had even really explicitly addressed civics, but I did have some teachers who really asked us to think about everything that we were talking about through the lens of what that means for society and who we are and what we want our goal to be. So I think in that sense, it's sort of up to different subject areas to bring different tools to bear on those sorts of questions. So I can see in an English language arts classroom, the ability to think creatively and use communication effectively to talk about the sort of issues that we want to talk about in a larger collective. I see that as being a great thing to bring to civics. And then I think from history classes, you can historicize what is happening in our everyday lives, you know, and you can take things that are getting written in our English journals and really look at them through a different lens. So, I mean, I agree that I think as much as the different disciplines and subject areas can work together to fuse these different, no, it's fusing the tools, but really expand that toolbox would be great. And then I think we also have to think about what out-of-school time programs are doing and what's happening after school, because I think a lot of civics is happening there when people are thinking about how to relate to their own communities and to other communities, and what that says about society.
You had your hand up, yes.
Hi, I'm Lila. I work for Generation Citizen. We're a national action civics education nonprofit, and we work with over 3,000 students in the greater Boston area. And so a lot of what you were talking about rings true with our organization. We have a really hard time getting our students to think past the business as usual, and much less getting them to think about technological fixes and seeing themselves as the change agents, as someone was saying. And so I have many questions, but you know, we have this in-class civics opportunity. We're trying to create a space for civics on its own, because civics and social studies and history keep getting cut and are increasingly tested, whereas it's the action and the projects that are making the projects, that's what's getting students to connect and to see themselves in the at that edge of disaster mode. So I'm struggling in my work right now, and would love to hear your thoughts on how can we get action civics to be prioritized in this current educational climate, so that there's a space for new civics and a space for deconstructing these narratives and bringing them to light.
Oh dear. I get depressed about this because it's true in the country I also live in as well. And the pressures on assessment and measurement are not helping either adventurousness and creativity in teaching, as everybody knows. And also, as you say, subjects like civics and so on get squeezed out for all kinds of reasons. I think that the way to make something like civics prioritized is for everyone to see its value, which we see as culturally and socially and politically and other ways, its value. And perhaps that's something that we haven't succeeded in doing. And increasingly, civics in one form it's taught is getting squeezed all over the world. I mean, there was to some extent, the idea that there was a problem about civic engagement by young people. They don't vote. Look like a possible impetus to civic education, but that seems to have died down. It isn't just about voting. Bob has his hand up. Do you have a solution? As always.
Yeah.
Good?
No, I don't, but it one of the strategies to do that is one that Catherine Snow and people in language and literacy are using, which is to actually develop what they call discipline-based literacy. So, I mean, in the current political climate, if it doesn't have something to do with reading and writing and literacy, you're not going to get the space. So the challenge that they've taken on is how to integrate literacy into what's called the discipline, social studies, history, civics, and so forth. And really, that means teaching kids academic language words that are civic, and getting them to use them. So it's not, I don't have the answer. Even I know that they have tremendous, there are tremendous debates even within that field. But that's just one thing you might want to. Are you also a student here?
No.
But you still could probably get access by connecting with some students. know that program and just kind of look at their curriculum. You can actually find their curriculum. It's open source and under word generation.
There is a tension here because, I mean, as picking up what Amelia was saying, if you define something as a distinct field, we call it civics, and say we need to teach this alongside everything else, it looks crowded. But on the other hand, it gives it visibility, but it also is any competition with everything else. If you can find a way of saying, look, this is actually permeates across the whole of the curriculum, then people will say, okay, it's there anyway, I do a bit of it in history and geography, but it gets lost. So there's really a balance where you say, look, this is a set of really important questions, ideas, bits of knowledge, interesting dilemmas, interesting things that touch kids' lives. Let's use them in all kinds of areas. Let's use them in geography. Let's use them even in science. I mean, I've been involved in another project which shows that actually kids see the ethical dimensions of science. I don't just mean about blowing up the world. And we can bring ethics into science and teach both ethics and science simultaneously in that way. And the alternative is to find a way of infiltrating civic topics into other areas, rather than marginalising it and branching it and making it, able to be hived off. One more question, and then we will stop, I think. Yes, Jen.
I'm Chen, a doctoral student here. So I'm very convinced that narrative matters, and it's very powerful. Therefore, I worry about it every day. That I think that the one serious problem we have is there are people who take the narrative so seriously and they hold on to it and they refuse to tolerate other narratives.
Yes.
And even if they have access and they understand other narrative, they refuse to believe it or they refuse to accept it. And how do you see it's going to happen that we not only expose them to multiple narratives, but have them to tolerate more narrative, understand others' narrative, and even change their narrative.
I think the quick answer, I'll give a quick answer because we have to stop, is actually, I would like to be optimistic and think that if people actually understand that these are narratives, and I don't mean they're not true, but they're narratives, they understand how the story they are telling is composed, where it comes from, what the assumptions are. If they can unpack their own narratives, they might be able to see that there are other possible narratives which are consistent with their narrative that come to different conclusions. I mean, perhaps the way to look at it is to see how narratives change at times of social change and what's happened. Let's take a particular narrative which I've often cited. 40 years ago when I was a young woman, people who were gay were seen as sick or at least immoral. And but they think this is different. And they were a problem. And even quite liberal people who said, well, we should be kind, saw being gay as a medical problem. Now we've got so far in changing things so rapidly, we can see the changes in the underlying narrative behind homosexuality, which has made it possible for really very conservative people in many countries to be completely accepting of all kinds of aspects of gay life. And what's happened has been the different narratives have come in. The pathologizing sickness narrative went, the alternative lifestyle, possibly the biological origins, overlaid always with a narrative of tolerance of difference and of diversity. And these two things, these narratives have been interwoven over the last 40 years. Was actually a very dramatic social change of attitudes towards homosexuality. So if you look at social change and what happens in the changing narrative, we may be able to learn. And I think the South African data is interesting because, I mean, I showed you just a snapshot, and it was very rapid, but you could see there ways that Mandela was trying to manipulate, quite effectively actually, the changing narratives from apartheid to post-apartheid.
Right, but the following question is, once some people realize their narrative are decomposable, they feel unsafe, like their whole world.
So you have to you have to support the anxious, otherwise the anxious will shrink it. At which point, I'm anxious that we finish. Thank you so much for your comments, and thank you for coming. I hope you'll come to the next one, which is going to be on the 8th of October. You'll see notifications of it. Have you all signed the sheet so we know you were here? Yes. If you haven't signed, please. Bonnie didn't sign. I think on your list anyway. It's all right. Thank you so much.
Thank you both very much. It was really stimulating. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Hey, it's good to see you.
Oh yeah, it's just knowledge. I wanted to ask if there's any books you recommend or if you wrote a book yourself that
I love things like that. And then you do course next semester. I love things like that.
Let's get it done.
In the meantime, I'd love to talk to you. I'd love to talk to you.
I mean, what day you want,
I was working on a project where we were doing artistic
oh, I'm sorry.
Almost done. They're really great online tools.
Methods course and also the A-Box.
Yeah, I love
We will, yes. But once you're on the list, you're going to get into it. We'll send it.
I didn't call out just because they were going to combine stuff.
Thank you so much.
You know, also
Okay, here we go.
I started taking my time with other programs and